Yeah.
Is that my cue?
No, just checking that some people just try to disrupt the meeting, so Mike's going to try and sort it out.
That happens because the thing's public. So if you have a waiting room, that can sometimes help because you recognise the names and you can switch that on.
Yeah. Okay, well let's carry on. Let's go on to Steve and let's carry on with the meeting. Steve, over to you now. Steve's going.
You're going to make me the host, yes?
Making Steve the host. He's going to take over the meeting.
Good. Okay, I'm now the host, and so hopefully I can share the screen and Marilyn can start to talk to us about her section of the book. So over to you, Marilyn, and I'll...
Thank you, Steve. I am going to, I'm afraid, read. Something's happened to my screen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
We can hear you, but I can't see you.
My screen's gone blank. Okay, if you can see me, I'll just keep talking.
Yes.
But Steve, if you could get it to work, that would be brilliant. Okay, the resistance from within the German working class to the Nazi regime from 1933 has been largely ignored or forgotten. Indeed, one common position is that apart from the well-known White Rose and the attempted militaristic coup of June 1944, hooray, there was almost no real resistance to the Nazis, and we shall be arguing the opposite. Smashing the left and the organized working class movement was central to Nazi ideology in practice. From the late 1920s till 1933, the Nazi stormtroopers, the SA, had in effect waged civil war on the streets of the largest cities. When anti-Nazis fought and defended themselves against the SA, the Nazi Party's unofficial army, often though not always, abetted by the police. Some years ago, I interviewed some people now dead who had been activists in Berlin, and they all talked of how it had been like a civil war on the streets and in working class communities in the years leading up to 33. What happened straight after the Nazis took power reveals their goals. On the night of the Reichstag fire in February 33, 1 month after Hitler became Chancellor, about 10,000 communists were arrested. Then in March and April, the SA and the police arrested 40 to 50,000 political opponents, 60,000 during 33 and 34, of whom 2,000 were murdered. Between 33 and 45, about half of the membership of the German Communist Party, the KPD, which is about 150,000, were detained and 30,000 were arrested by the end of the war. The Gestapo records, of course, one has to be careful because it's Gestapo, but the Gestapo records calculate that close on 1 million leftists were imprisoned or sent to camps between 33 and 44, of whom only 100,000 survived. Within weeks of coming to power, the Nazis had closed down around 200 social democratic newspapers, occupied around 50 communist newspaper offices, and imprisoned thousands of journalists and printers. Of the 2,000 Berlin worker athletes who belonged to clubs which had been made illegal because they were connected to the two parties, about 500 were arrested. From 33, it was members of left organizations who led the underground resistance rather than the leaderships. Although the Social Democrats were much larger than the communists, it was the members and sympathizers of the communists who generally organized the underground. The Social Democratic leadership believed overwhelmingly in the parliamentary route rather than a legal struggle. Most of their members who wanted to take on the Nazis left and joined splinter organizations, which had a greater impact than their small numbers suggest. Also, the advantages of groups such as the Communist Party opposition, a left breakaway from the KPD, or the Socialist Workers' Party, a left breakaway from the Social Democrats, not today's Socialist Workers' Party, was that they supported a united front. Unlike either the KPD, who saw the Social Democrats as social fascists, or the Social Democrats, who saw the KPD as anti-parliamentary cretins. An early example of a communist-led anti-Nazi group were the virtually unknown Gebauer group, which at great risk smuggled wanted comrades out across the mountains into Czechoslovakia and anti-Nazi literature in. Their members were almost all murdered, and the resistance was all but destroyed by 35-36. The second phase of the resistance essentially began after the outbreak of war, and more so after the end of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. The Communist Party's emphasis was now on the defeat of Nazism and restoring parliamentary democracy rather than on socialism. The best known of these groupings was the Baum Group, who, whether for good or ill, is associated with the one act of sabotage when they tried and failed to blow up the anti-Soviet propaganda exhibition, the Soviet Paradise, which goes in quotes, in 1942, leading to terrible revenge killings by the SS. The KPD leadership's emphasis, I shall now focus on the Edelweiss Pirates, who lasted as a resistance force where other more organized groups were destroyed. Hitler saw youth as his top priority. The Aryan Young and the Hitler Youth were to be the foundation stone of the 1,000-year life, as opposed to the youth who were the people's enemies. The Edelweiss Pirates, for instance, were an extraordinary loose network of teenagers who rebelled against the Nazis and the Hitler Youth, almost all of whom came from a working class background. They wore outlandish clothes, sang anti-militaristic songs, and went in for soft sabotage. Jülich, a survivor, there weren't many, recalled how he and his friends threw bricks through the windows of munitions factories and poured water into the petrol tanks of Nazis' cars. There's some limited evidence that they derailed trains which were carrying ammunition and supplied adult resistance groups with explosives. Some stole food and supplies from freight trains. They sprayed graffiti onto walls, down with Hitler, down with Nazi brutality. In a few places, they attacked groups of Hitler Youth with brass knuckles and deflated the tires of their bikes, apparently contributing to a significant leakage from the Hitler Youth into the pirates. Quite risky to do that. On one occasion, they rained leaflets from the dome of Cologne station and occasionally offered shelter to army deserters, escaped prisoners, as well as a few Jews. The Gestapo hated them not just for what they did, for what they represented. The Gestapo hunted them and imprisoned boys and girls as young as 15 or 16 for acts as trivial as not giving the fascist salute or for the unconventional clothes they wore. Their songs were seen as glorifying non-Aryan types. In a single day of raids in December 42, the Düsseldorf Gestapo made more than 1,000 arrests of those they saw as members of the Edelweiss Pirates. Captured pirates had their heads shaven or were threatened and beaten, imprisoned, sent to jails, reform schools, psychiatric hospitals, hundreds to labor and concentration camps. And many lost their lives. In Cologne, a member of the pirates was publicly hung. I can't remember, I think it was 15 or 16. But more was to come. An escaped prisoner, Hans Bommer Steinbruck, planned to blow up the Gestapo headquarters and led a raid on a local arms depot, but an acquaintance had typically informed the Gestapo. Although the details aren't clear, there ensued a battle between the pirates and the Cologne Gestapo, in which the chief of the Cologne Gestapo was killed. But in November 44, 13 leading Edelweiss pirates were publicly hanged in Cologne. There were other areas of resistance, and I'm going to mention some of these briefly. The organized underground tried to create contacts with workers, but even leafleting was dangerous, and there was very limited success. The focus was usually on trying to build cells in factories, which was a nigh impossible task. But by 1939, there were 89 factory cells just in Berlin. Their priority was organizing sabotage in the arms industry, which distinguishes them from the more bourgeois oppositional groups. Groups such as the Ulrich Group or the Seeflau Group, both led by members of the Communist Party, tried to build cells in factories, especially munitions. In some factories, there were attempts at small acts of sabotage or merely going slow. If caught, the perpetrator was lucky to be sent to a camp. There is a debate, which maybe we'll come back to, which is that given how organized the German working class had been before 1933, how far can the limited industrial militancy, which occasionally bubbled up after 33, how far can that be seen as a product of anti-Nazism rather than just of economistic demands? The German economy became dependent on foreign labor. Although the Nazis abhorred the use of so-called voluntary or coerced foreign laborers, especially in an industry as strategic as armaments, such was their need for labor that increasingly it was foreign workers, prisoners of war, and later concentration camp prisoners who worked there. It's impossible to know exactly, but between 25 to 40% of workers in Germany and Greater Germany by 1944 were foreign civilian, again in quotes, workers, prisoners of war, people from concentration camps, etc. Many of the voluntary foreign women were women, let me say that again. Many of the voluntary foreign workers were women from countries the Nazis had invaded, and in fact forced to become workers. In some individual companies, the number of non-German workers was as high as 80 to 90%. Millions of slave laborers were used by ThyssenKrupp, IG Farben, Messerschmitt, Daimler-Benz, amongst others. At the Krupp factory in Essen in 1943, there were 3,700 Soviet POWs and 6,000 Soviet civilian workers, many of whom will have been women. At Daimler-Benz, which had close ties with the Nazi regime and was a key arms manufacturer, in July 1942, 53% of the workers were Russians, rising to 67% by 44. It was often the non-German workers who tried to disrupt production at a terrible cost. The Gestapo's resources were overwhelmingly directed against disciplining foreign workers. They arrested 388,000 foreign workers for political crimes. Political just means doing something they didn't like. In the first 9 months of 1943 alone, of whom 2,600 were for breach of work. Even workers from concentration camps occasionally resisted, and I'm going to give one example. The V2s were produced in the tunnels of Dora Mittelbau, largely dug into the ground by Russian and Polish slave laborers with an especially high death rate. Albert Kuntz, head of the communist underground group, organized sabotage amongst the 60,000 prisoners who worked there. On January 44, the first 3 rockets were delivered, all of which suffered from serious production defects, cause unknown. 200 foreign workers were then hung from hooks in the underground galleries. Over 13 months, only 6,000 of the plant's 12,000 V2s were produced, and half didn't work. It cost the resistance dear, but some Londoners will have owed them their lives. I'm going to end by asking a few questions. Firstly, what was distinctive about the Nazi regime? The Nazi regime from its beginning was committed to destroying the left and the organized working class, and almost instantly tore up the bourgeois or constitutional rules of the Weimar Republic, which, though they limited, allowed some hard fought for rights and some legal and political space for struggle. Although it hasn't been the focus of this talk, the working class in Germany was well organized, or had been well organized, in trade unions and political parties, usually the Social Democrats. One of the main reasons, if not the main reason, why the Nazis got the support of significant sections of the German ruling class and petty bourgeoisie was to destroy the organizations of the working class. Another distinction between the Nazis and one's usual autocratic or right-wing regime is that following the lead of the SA, they put forward what sound like socialist demands. They were, in theory, in favor of progressive taxation and the redistribution of wealth. Remember that Nazi stands for National Socialist. The SA saw themselves as a worker-based revolutionary group and recruited from the same working class communities as the left. But the contradiction within the Nazi party with their ultra-right supporters and business supporters proved too much for the Nazi hierarchy, needless to say, and the SA were brutally murdered during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. Why has it been so regularly overlooked that the Nazi regime's first targets were working class anti-Nazis, and that we remember the White Rose and the attempted military coup of June 44, but not the Edelweiss pirates? Indeed, insofar as the Edelweiss pirates are remembered, they are presented more as hooligans and criminals rather than as anti-Nazis. While the White Rose students were extraordinarily brave and deserved to be remembered, they came from respectable middle-class backgrounds, while the Edelweiss pirates certainly did not respect the rules and usually were working class. And though there could not be anything more respectable than a section of the military leadership turning on Hitler, though their motive was as much to do to stop Hitler from destroying Germany as building a new reformed Germany, sorry, that's gone wrong. Basically, what I'm saying is that the military were respectable resistance to Hitler, especially as they didn't have far-fangled social democratic ideas. In addition, that was me being sarcastic. In addition, very few of the working class resistance, or indeed the Edelweiss pirates, lived to tell the tale. So there are few inherited memories, because we partly learn history through inherited memories. Though much of the resistance to the Nazis has been forgotten, Steve and I have spotted a surprising interest in our book. It's a good time to remember these heroes. And my final paragraph is, how far the active anti-Nazis contributed to Germany's defeat is unknowable, but at a minimum, their struggle diverted the Gestapo and the SS and thus saved others' lives. It also reminds us of how it is possible to try to resist even against Nazi barbarity. It reminds us how it was the rank and file members of the Communist Party, and to a lesser extent the Social Democrats, who regularly risked their lives organizing against the Nazi regime. It reminds us that the Nazis' initial and continuing target was the left, first in Germany, but then in every country they occupied. It reminds us to never ignore apparently insignificant nationalist and racist utterances, whoever may make them today. Ultimately, it reminds us that despite the likelihood of death, that not everyone submits to tyranny. Thank you. That's me.
Right. Thank you very much, Marilyn. You might have noticed I've handed the hosting over to Mike Barton, who is Assistant Secretary of my union branch. Will assist in doing this, as he always does with everything else. Okay. I'm going to talk about German volunteers in the French resistance. There were a surprising number of foreign volunteers in the French resistance, a fact that's barely recognised today, as the history of the resistance has been nationalised and has become the founding myth of the French Republic, rather as the myths of Dunkirk and the Blitz are used in Britain. But their story starts in Spain, where there were somewhere in the region of 4,000 German and Austrian volunteers in the international brigades. And of course, these volunteers were engaged in fighting against the armies of the lands of their birth, even then. When the Spanish Republic took the ill-advised decision to disband the International Brigade in October 1938, the German and Austrian volunteers had nowhere to return to, and most ended up as refugees in France, where the majority were interned in French concentration camps, where they were kept in vile conditions. Given the large-scale immigration into France following the First World War, the CGTU, Trade Union Federation, under communist leadership, set up an organisation called Main d'œuvre immigrée, the MOI, literally immigrant labour, to organise these migrant workers. It was divided into language sections, principally Polish, Italian, Yiddish and Spanish. These sections became the basis for the organisation of resistance by foreign workers in France. The French Communist Party set up the Francs-Tireurs et Partisans, the FTP, at the end of 1941 to act as an armed resistance organisation. And the different language sections of the MOI also organised armed groups known as the FTP-MOI. There was a particularly important FTP-MOI movement based in Lyon and Grenoble, the Compagnie Camagnole Liberté, mainly composed of Yiddish-speaking immigrant workers from Central Europe, but it was commanded by a German communist called Norbert Kugler. One of their fighters was a German Jewish, actually Zionist, called Herbert Hertz. He became the technician and made their what we would now call improvised explosive devices, and managed to blow up a platoon of German soldiers as they left their barracks in 1942. Similarly, we have the case of Max Bings, who managed to blow up the Wehrmacht officers' mess in Nice, killing a large number of Wehrmacht and SS soldiers, SS officers. Considerable effort was put into propaganda amongst German soldiers. There were two main approaches. There was the communist Travaillement, or German work, which distributed the paper Soldat im Westen, which took a fairly patriotic line. We are the good Germans, the Nazis are the traitors. But also the Trotskyists had a paper called Arbeiter und Soldat, which took a much more openly revolutionary socialist position. But up to 1944, both organisations only managed to attract individual German soldiers, most of whom were then betrayed and executed or deported. For example, we have Albert Hauser, who was a Wehrmacht soldier. He worked with the French resistance in Dijon until the Gestapo caught him. He was then sent to forced labour, building V2 bunkers in the north of France. He escaped during an air raid, was found by a French peasant wandering in her fields. She moved him on to the French underground, who nursed him back to health, and following discussions with the German Communist Party in exile, dispatched him to join a resistance group near Clermont-Lérault, where he participated in the liberation of Montpellier. Dora Schull, a German communist of Jewish heritage, was interned in a camp at Bern. She escaped to Lyon, where she managed to obtain work in the Wehrmacht post office, ironically, immediately opposite Klaus Barbie's Gestapo office. This enabled her to keep tabs on the comings and goings of the Gestapo and to inform the Lyon resistance. There was a very heavy price to pay for this activity. Over 100 Travaillant activists, mainly women, were executed or died in deportation. And the Trotskyist Arbeiter and Soldat group in Brittany also was betrayed, and 25 of them were shot or deported. But there was some success. Lieutenant Hans Heysel recalls lending his Luger automatic pistol to the FTP-MOI to assassinate SS Standartenführer von Ritter. Hans Heysel, Kurt Halker, and Arthur Erband worked in the communications department of the headquarters of the German Navy in Paris, from where they were able to pass on a wealth of sensitive information. When the uprising that liberated Paris broke out in 1944, they deserted with their weapons, joined the insurgents, and ended up as part of the group that defended the headquarters of the French Communist Party. So there were a considerable number of individual histories of this sort, but in the case of serving German soldiers, the rebellion seems to have been mainly on an individual basis. From mid-1942, there was a mass rural revolt in France, and the guerrillas were in reality the armed spearhead of a mass movement. The trigger for this revolt was the Service du Travail Obligatoire, the STO, the forced requisition of young French workers to go and work in factories in Germany, caused thousands of young men to flee into the country, where they were sheltered by the rural population. In turn, it was logical for these réfractaires, as they were called, to arm themselves against the forces of repression. They then quickly turned from defense to attack, from being the hunters to the hunted. And this was a milieu that welcomed Spanish, German, Yugoslav, Italian, and Jewish veterans of the international brigades, as they had a common enemy in the German occupation forces. And these veterans, their previous military experience was much appreciated. The German authorities certainly saw the situation as a rural revolt and treated the peasants in the villages with extreme brutality. There was a general policy of burning villages, massacring civilians in areas of strong Maquis activity in an attempt to terrorize the base of support of the guerrilla bands. In this brutal war, the civilian supporters were just as much in the front line as the fighters in the hills. And this affected women particularly. In the cemetery of Alès in the Gard province are two tombstones recording the murders of Hedwig Robins and Lisa Ost. It says, Partisan allemand mort pour la liberté, assassiné par le Gestapo. These two German women, formerly of the international brigades, were acting as a courier and a nurse for the local Maquis when they were picked up in an SS raid and killed by the German security service. Of the German forces, 3/4 of the SS in France were not German citizens. By the middle of 1943, the German armed forces were facing a serious manpower shortage, and as a result started recruiting non-German men. There were Poles and Czechs forcibly conscripted from their occupied territories, Yugoslav Muslims from Bosnia, who joined more or less willingly in the belief that this would ensure German protection from oppression by their Catholic Croat neighbours. But the largest contingent of non-German members of the SS were from the Soviet Union. In mid-August 1944, with the US forces advancing across France, the predominantly Ukrainian 30th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS was shipped to the Haute-Savoie region in eastern France. Some were nationalists who joined to resist what they saw as Soviet occupation of the Ukraine. Others had been in the Red Army, captured while fighting against the Germans and ending up in a prison camp. The only future for them was either serving in the SS or a short brutish existence with a likely violent death in the POW camps where 1.5 million Soviet prisoners of war were deliberately starved to death. Whatever their reasons for joining, these Ukrainians had little interest in fighting in France, while their German officers treated them with racist contempt. The senior Ukrainian officer, Major Lev Obla, I've surely pronounced that wrong, made contact with the local forces of the French resistance and planned their mutiny. While marching through the Savoy countryside, Lev Obla shouted the order, "Helmets on!" And as the German officers and NCOs were occupied obeying the order, the Ukrainians shot, stabbed, or beat them to death. The German dead numbered 394, including nearly 100 officers, and 820 Ukrainians then joined the waiting French resistance and fought alongside them until the end of the war. But a purist might say that despite wearing German uniforms, these people were not strictly speaking traitors, as they were not ethnic Germans. So let's finish with some who were. Otto Kuhn was a communist railway worker who'd been elected as a Reichstag deputy. He fled to France, where he was interned as an undesirable alien in a labour camp working as a woodcutter. In 1943, Otto Kuhn and about 40 of his comrades, mainly German veterans of the International Brigade, escaped into the Cevennes Mountains, where the German army only controlled the main roads. These German volunteers became the core of an extremely effective guerrilla organisation who played an important part in the liberation of the town of Nîmes, where Norbert Beisacker was given the honour of taking down the swastika flag from the town hall. Martin Kalb, who led the German fighters in the battle for Nîmes, is pictured in the front rank as they marched in a parade to liberate to celebrate the liberation, with Norbert Beisacker carrying the French tricolour. Albert Kuhn himself was appointed a colonel in the French army and led a force of 2,000 fighters, mainly French, but including a significant number of Armenian deserters from the SS who had mutinied. To finish, on July the 14th, 1994, the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Paris, President François Mitterrand invited the German Chancellor of the time, Helmut Kohl, to attend the parade in which German military personnel of the Eurocorps were participating. At the request of the French resistance associations, the government had agreed to forward to the federal government a list of German citizens who had participated in the resistance in France. Helmut Kohl refused to allow them on the platform, and Mitterrand did not insist. So 2 German veterans, including one Peter Gingol, 2 German veterans of the French resistance, stood on the pavement wearing their French medals, taking the salute as the German troops marched by. Thank you. Right, am I still in charge, or is Mary? Is Bernadette going to take over? She's muted.
People can unmute themselves, but I'll pass over to whoever you want. It's not a problem.
Right. Well, let's have some questions. You can raise your hand. You can cough. You can wave loudly.
Are we taking one question at a time and then you and I answer, or how are we doing it?
Let's wait till we get a question first, shall we? Let's see. Does anyone wish to ask any questions, make any comments? I noticed that there were several comments from Ben in the chat, if he maybe wants to say something to us.
Thanks, Steve. I did it very much ad hoc, and I don't have any sort of continuous conceptual grasp of how I should sort of phrase questions. So if I may leave it to the judgment of Marilyn and Steve to select from the chat column and give some replies, and hopefully also if participants can have access to the chat column after this session closes, that would be very helpful, because jotting down, what was it, Jan Peterson's Our Street? I mean, it's difficult to cobble all this together and make notes unless it's preserved electronically and made available to participants. Thank you very much indeed.
I noticed that it says the chat says Irena has a question. Do you wish to ask Irena?
Yeah, it's not a question. It's more a comment. Actually, two interrelated comments. One about the Edelweiss-Piraten, which is, by the way, what the Nazis called them. It's a bit like Kristallnacht. You know, we sort of accepted it. There was one Bartholomäus Schlink in Cologne. He was one of the ones who was hanged when he was 16. In the 1970s, his mother applied for restitution, and she was told that people who came from that background, i.e. working class, wouldn't be able to understand the nuances. So he was classified as a criminal. The other point, in the chat, there was a reference to the son of Stauffenberg who went to an English school. And it's very interesting that after the war, they set up a special fund for the children of those who were involved in the 20th of July assassination attempt. And that a special fund was set up for them so that they could attend private schools and could have fancy holidays. Of course, nothing like that for the children of the working class resistance.
Can I say something?
Yep, carry on.
I mean, thank you, Irena. Yes. I just wanted to add something about the von Stauffenberg family. I mean, some of you may have visited the Memorial Museum in Berlin. And the son, I can't remember his name, but the son basically said, if you display communists as heroes, I'm going to withdraw cooperation with your museum. So that even in the late 1980s, they were still saying that the communists were not legitimate anti-Nazis. It's an extraordinary story. Sorry, thank you.
If I can answer one thing, a couple of things that Ben raised. He takes issue with my use of the term traitor, saying it's a bourgeois comment, a bourgeois concept. I rather take it as a badge of pride, frankly. But so I was using it in those terms. Perhaps I should have put inverted commas around it, like Marilyn does frequently, and so on. And he asked about the Armenians that I mentioned. There was an Armenian brigade of the SS that had been recruited, often semi-forcibly, the alternative being starved to death in a prisoner of war camp, who had been in the Red Army. The Armenian the Armenian-speaking section of the MOI, particularly in Marseille, had managed to get close contact with these Armenian soldiers, and there was details are scarce on this one. I can't find much out about it, but there were several. It ended up with several hundred Armenian SS men killing their German officers and changing sides, but that's it's a bit. I need to do more work on that one. Just to point out that if you want to raise your hand, if you click on participants, you'll see in the bottom corner there should be something that says raise your hand. And I see that Danny Riley has raised his hand obediently. Well done, Danny. Speak.
I just wanted to draw your attention to a question I've put in the chat box.
Please
I
do.
think I'm up to actually following the chat box as well as looking at the pictures.
Could
Yeah.
you read it out then, Steve, rather than me repeat it? Yeah.
No, I can't find it now. Where is it? Oh, has it just gone up?
Well, I'll read it out. Could you expand on what the consequences are of the sanitization of history you two have exposed for the versions of history received in UK institutions?
I'll take that first, Steve, if that's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one has to look at historiography, within the political context. And in fact, I mean, Arena's comment, the question, was very relevant because, once we got to 47, 48, Cold War descended, and it didn't just descend politically, it descended in terms of, historians. And one basically then had a shift to Germany becoming accepted as part of a kind of, a bourgeois alliance where anti-Nazis were quite likely to be seen as criminals or as traitors, etc. And where's he gone? And it wasn't really till I would say the late 1980s, I mean, before 1990, but that one started to get a moving away from that position, and a more of an acceptance of an anti-Nazi resistance from the left. But I mean, what you've also had parallel to that, and it's kind of coming back to the surface, is a debate as to whether Germany was responsible for the Second World War, whether the Nazis were responsible for the Second World War. And that's a debate which is now partly resurfacing. So, I mean, I think as well, there's a third level, which is the debate over the Nazis and the Holocaust, where there was a shift really with the Eichmann trial of starting to see Nazism much more as being anti-Semitic rather than being as anti-left. So I think, I don't know if I've answered your question, and I can't see you anymore, but I think those three things kind of have combined to mean that when people are taught about Nazism, they're not taught the way that Steve and I have discussed it. They're not taught in terms of class, they're not taught in terms of there being Germans who were anti-Nazis.
Yeah, from my point of view, the Second World War has become the myths around the Second World War. I mean, it amazes me that they go on about the Dunkirk spirit all the time, when Dunkirk was the worst defeat the British Army had suffered since the Zulus smashed them at Isandlwana. I mean, but that's become, and it's become the foundation myth in Britain very much, of all our liberties, all our bourgeois liberties, and so on. And similarly in France, the French resistance seen very much as a national coming together. So it doesn't fit in to have people who, out of principle, sort of fought for countries other than the country of their birth. It's also in the way that the kind of "we won the war" sort of attitude that I was certainly brought up with completely neglects the with the secondary role given to the United States, but that was it, with completely ignoring the role of the Indian soldiers, completely ignoring the role of the Red Army, and so on, which then. And of course, the idea that it was somehow other than a national war where people fought for their own nations doesn't really fit in with that. This has been challenged quite well, in my view, by Donny Gluckstein's A People's History of the Second World War and Chris Bambury's The Second World War, A Marxist History, which, and I think the idea that Donny Gluckstein comes up with, that there were two wars running in parallel, what he calls an imperialist war and what he calls, more loosely, a people's war. It's certainly true in France, where the majority of the French employing class supported the Nazis. Because they'd had a bad fight with the Popular Front in 1936. The 1934 attempted fascist coup in France had failed. And the Nazis kind of offered to, basically smashed so much of the working class organisation, and I think that makes uncomfortable reading in terms of the national curriculum, and so that's kind of why this is being forgotten, which I suppose is why we're having to do it now, and people haven't done it up to now. There have been some, I mean, Tony Merson, was it Tony Merson's book, work, and Tom Mason's work earlier in the last century were very useful. But by and large, it's been ignored by even by left-wing historians. I see that someone has written in the chat that Kate has a question. Does Kate want to ask her question? She would have to unmute herself first, I think.
Hello. I asked it in the chat. Well, the first one thing I want to say, I've read Marilyn's section of the book, but I haven't got onto yours, Steve, yet, but I'm looking forward to it. I mean, the amount of research you've unearthed is astounding, I think. I mean, it's such invaluable research. I mean, is it a lifetime's work getting that? I mean, you do deal with the difficulties of researching, getting source material, but I'd be interested in that. And it was me who asked the question about Jan Peterson's Our Street, because it was years ago I read that, a sort of grassroots account of anti-Nazi activity in Berlin-Charlottenburg. And I remember being very impressed with the book at the time, but I haven't got a copy, and I was wondering if it's authentic.
What was I'm sorry, the line's not that clear. What was the book you referred to just
Our
then?
Street, Jan Peterson.
That is still available. Peterson's book is available, and it is worth getting hold of. I mean, even more if you can read in German, which I can't. Okay, I mean, can I answer? Is it okay to answer the point? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that book, my bit of that book was not a life's work, but what has happened in a way, it ties in with Danny's question, is that really from the late 1980s, there's a shift in like dominant German political culture, so that you start to get little local, I'll call them local authorities, that wouldn't be the word in German, but little authorities who start wanting to reclaim their resistance fighters, so that when you go onto the web, you will find that, many little places are now writing about, they're laying claim to the fact that they were not Nazis. I mean, what you also get, and Irena might be able to say more about this than me, is you have an organization called the VVN, which was set up in 1946, Irena? Anyway, it was set up soon after the Second World War, of communist resistance fighters, and it still exists, and they have drawn together people's autobiographies or biographies, which is very useful. But of course, one of the problems is how many of these people were murdered, And I mean, how many of the resistance fighters were murdered? So, you know, there is even more of a question about, if you like, accuracy and reliability than there usually is. But those were my sort of sources. Plus, I interviewed people. I mean, again, that was thanks to Arena. I interviewed people, and that was invaluable because it gives you a smell. It gives you a smell of what life was like as an anti-Nazi in the 30s. Have I answered your question? Yeah.
And in my case, firstly, to apologise, I'm dreadful with names. The author was Alan Merson, Irania was quite correctly pointed out to me, who wrote a book, Communist Resistance in Nazi Germany, which is, but as Joanna has pointed out in the chat, it is tended to be overlooked, and it wasn't wide. It was the Lawrence and Wishart affair, and it's tended to be overlooked. But it is a very valuable source and well worth.
Very, very valuable. Yeah.
Very valuable source. In my case, I've been poking around in little municipal resistance museums in France for the past 20 odd years. I used to do quite a few cycling holidays in France. Nearly every department has got a resistance museum, and I was really struck at how many of them have a German, a Spaniard, who is a local hero. Sometimes a main street is named after these people, sort of foreign fighters who joined the French resistance, who were very much appreciated locally. But there's not been much done to generalise this. There was a conference in Besançon in the early 90s where they did get together quite a few people, but it tends not to be on a national scale. It's not well known. So really, I've just been poking around in resistance museums, getting little stories of people. Very often, the people who run the local museums are a veteran of the resistance themselves. So it's all been quite So it's added a bit of intellectual activity to my cycling holidays, was how it really started. I noticed that Leslie Catchpole has got a blue hand up.
Okay. Yeah, Steve, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Obviously, Marilyn finished a session talking about taking different questions and trying to give different definitions of what Nazism was all about and that. And it started me thinking, because currently with us all being locked down, I think we are all talking about within our little circles and that, what popularism is and how it distinguishes from Nazism and that. And what I wanted to ask both of you, obviously where there's a general acceptance that, popularism was not Nazism, where does this end? And when does this beast, or could this beast become fascism? And with that in mind, how should we as the organised working class actually attempt to actually to attack popularism? Should we use similar tactics to obviously Nazism, or is that totally off the wall? So I don't know if that's a fair question or not.
Steve, do I go first?
Yeah, please, $64,000.
Okay, I mean, I think that there were certain, history never repeats itself. But nevertheless, I think that there were certain things that really were distinctive about Nazism, which is not rerunning anywhere at this point. I mean, first of all, although I didn't talk about it, I mean, Germany had massive uprisings in the 1919, 1919. It had failed revolutions. The reason I mention it is because the Social Democratic sent in a group called the Freikorps, who were basically many of them were ex-military. They were not the army, but the Social Democrats sent them in because they didn't trust the army. Why is that relevant? Because the Freikorps, who were fervently anti-communist, then really gave rise to the SA. So that I think one sees the growth of the Nazi Party very much as a response to the revolutionary upheavals of 1918-19, and also the fact that, you know, Germany had a very strong working class. I mean, that's one of the terrible ironies. You know, it had a higher level of organization than any working class, including the British working class. So that, you know, Nazism is a counter-reaction to working class organization and to the strength of the left. I think that's one thing. I think something else which is distinctive about Nazism, and I tend to go on about this because I think it's important, is that Nazism really did grow. Its adherents were both organized by the Nazi Party. I mean, the SA, etc. You know, they were a force that wasn't just spontaneous, like, you know, Trump supporters come out and they were generally supported by Trump, but they weren't organized. I mean, Steve has a most wonderful picture of the SA marching down the street in 1932, you know, like a military force with the police standing on either side. So that, you know, there was a really strong organized force attached to the party. And it also had, it made an appearance of having socialist demands. You know, I get impatient when people think that just because somebody says redistribute wealth, they've got to be left wing. No, they don't. You know, so that I think that the Nazi Party, even though they can be seen as, to quote you, although the Nazi Party were populists, many populists are not Nazis for those sort of reasons. I think the way we organize against it is just the old slow fashion that we've all been organizing in all our life. You have to start at the grassroots, you organize in your trade unions, in your anti-racist groups, etc. I don't think there are any shortcuts.
If I can, to give an example, many of my friends down in Kent, in Thanet, were involved in the campaign against Nigel Farage when he was standing to be the MP, and they approached it, I think, quite correctly, very differently from the way that we've approached dealing with, say, the National Front or the British movement. They leafleted all of their meetings. They spoke to people. They didn't hit anybody. And so on. And I think that's kind of, you know, and made sure that they raised the issues. They managed to find some retired miners from the colliery who were prepared to reactivate some of their old networks and so on. And as a result of which, Nigel Farage did not get elected. And I think that was important. But I suspect that had they treated him as if he were a Nazi and kind of gone in and tried to break up the meeting, A, they'd probably have lost, and B, I don't think it would have been successful. So I think it is a question of recognising that difference, and as Marilyn says, you know, see that the real important difference about fascism is its preparedness to use overwhelming force to smash working class organisation. I see Linda's put her hand up. Linda Clark?
Yeah, it was my question. Have you done anything to publish a book in Germany in German? And when is it going to be published, or is it already published in Germany?
I pass that on to Steve.
That's easy to answer. No, neither of us. Our German isn't good enough to write it into German. We haven't actually got anyone who's actually translating it for us as yet. It would be lovely to. We've sold quite a few copies of the English edition to German people in Germany. So there has been a certain amount of interest, but we haven't got around to do it. So any volunteers to translate it into German, even a section of it, even a reduced version of it, you'll be our friends for life. I noticed someone called Compact has raised his hand. Chap in a reddish shirt. Yes, waving your hand, but you're muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Right. Scott Reeve should have come out. Oh, can you all hear me?
Nearly.
Oh,
Speak
right.
closer. Speak closer.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Two things. On the anti-Nazi resistance before Nazis came to power, was really we can learn lessons from fact how the German work class, how the socialist and communist movement was split, well, they were fighting each other.
Steve, I can't hear.
Oh, sorry. Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, good. Oh, the Communist Party had a line of called the social fascists, or the social democrats were in government with liberals running an equivalent of an austerity regime, which was deeply anti-working class in the sense of living standards, etc., cutting wages, that there was mass unemployment and raising inflation, and it was a top-down organization, all of them, so that when the Nazis smashed the leadership, they were waiting for a line, instructions from the leadership, but the head was no longer there. Now that's it. And my next question is that what reaction was there to the communist anti-Nazi resistance in September 1939?
I'm really sorry, Steve. Can you take that?
Yes. I mean, I think we can overdo blaming the leadership for they didn't give us a lead. They didn't give a lead. That's true. They should have done. But I think what comes out of that is we need to make sure that we build working class organizations that are capable of responding whether our leaders ask us to or not, or indeed when they forbid us to, because and I think just to take the importance I would see of, we speak of the Battle of Cable Street. The importance of that was that the leadership of the Labour Party certainly opposed it. The official leadership of the Jewish community opposed the resistance to Mosley and Cable Street. Certain elements of the Communist Party leadership were very slow in coming towards it, but the local Jewish population, Communist population, and Labour Party supporters, trade unionists were quite clear that they were going to do it come what may. And I think that that's that's the importance. Similarly, the defeat of the 1934 attempted fascist coup in France was defeated by a general strike that started in the factories with communist and socialist workers marching out together, and the leadership of the official trade unions and the parties jumping on what was then a rolling bandwagon. So it's to me, it's base up organisation that will operate whether or not our leaders say we can or not. That will save the day in the end. Yeah, thank you. Is there any?
That's the point I'm making.
Right, Howard Feather.
Yeah, sorry, can you say a bit more about the attempted coup? I don't know anything about that.
Right, 1934. What happened was there were various leagues in France, right-wing organisations, ex-servicemen's organisations, things like the Croix de Fer, and so on, various right-wing ex-servicemen's organisations and older, not necessarily fascist, but violent extreme right-wingers, like I forgot the name of Mauras's organisation, and so on, that planned a march on the French Parliament. Massive extreme right-wing march. The French Parliament looked like it was going to give way and surrender. It was really kind of, and then both the Communist Party and the Socialist Party called for demonstrations the next day. This march had ended up with massive violence in the Place de la Concorde, the extreme right-wing march. Lots of blood flowed on both sides, the police and the demonstrators. So for the next day, the Socialist Party and the Communist Party called a demonstration, but two separate demonstrations, and they were supposed to march in opposite directions. That didn't happen. The workers joined together, marched. There were some wonderful pictures of them exchanging banners, or a socialist on one end and a communist on the other end of a banner, and that sort of thing. And that very quickly spread into a general strike. That broke the extreme right-wing threat, and actually gave the impetus to what then became the Popular Front. And it was, I would argue, that the French employing class, which had really hoped that this 1934 right-wing coup, or whatever it was going to be, would do the same as what the Nazis had done in Germany, were extremely disappointed, and which is why they quite welcomed the Nazi invasion, particularly in the north of France, in the mines and the textile industry. I found a French factory owner writing to the local paper in Roubaix, where he said, "I would rather have my country occupied by the Germans than my factory occupied by my employees." And I think that rather kind of sums it up.
Yeah. Thanks, that's great.
Anyone else? Anyone else?
Hello.
Hello, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, it was just a further comment on the 1929, 33, 32 in Germany, because there's been quite a lot of work being done starting in the 1980s. There's stuff being done on the young people, because the fighters, particularly in Berlin, were mainly working class kids defending their areas. And the Communist Party, although they sponsored it, had a very ambiguous response. These guys wanted guns to shoot the SA, the Communist Party said guns will only come out the day before the revolution. Now, those people will have formed some of the base for subsequent anti-Nazi activities, but they were also often in areas where they were competing directly with the SA for control of what we would call council housing blocks and pubs, taverns. And as soon as the SA got the permission from the national government, they will have moved straight into those areas to try and smash up that grassroots activism. And there was a continuing ambiguity from the Communist Party until they were all locked up, at which point you couldn't be ambiguous anymore, but you couldn't do anything very much.
Right, I think we're coming to the end of this. Does Bernadette?
Irena has a hand up.
Oh, right, Irena. You probably have to unmute yourself. Where's Irena?
Sorry. Yeah, here I am. I just wanted to add something to what Marilyn said about the VVN. It wasn't actually, it was set up in 1946, but it wasn't just for communist resistors. It was actually for all resistors. And a similar thing happened to what Marilyn observed in the Berlin Museum. That the people who didn't want to associate with communists, they went somewhere else. They set up another organization. So it was part of the Cold War that it ended up. I mean, it was the VVN was based on the oath of Buchenwald. Just after the never against war, never again war, never again fascism. And I think it was the same thing. It was, what later became, known as the Holocaust, that you oppose the Holocaust, but when you oppose fascism, that's somehow not quite the right thing. Yeah. Sorry, it's just a point I wanted to make.
Thank you very much. Right, Bernadette, do you want to sum up now?
Yes, can I just say thank you to Steve and Marilyn for a wonderful talk. Made me feel I really didn't know very much about this history, even though I've read your book. I need to obviously learn a lot more. If people want to buy the book, they can have a look at it. It's on the Mary Quaile blog, so they can find Steve and Marilyn's details there if they want to buy a book, buy a copy of the book, and I would encourage them to. I'd like to thank everybody for taking part today. It's been really interesting. And we'll be having another Mary Quaile talk at the end of January. We'll be looking at writing up your own history and working class history. Thank you for taking part.
Bye bye all. Bye bye. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for arranging it.